How much do you really know about past ascent? Well, let's find out. Alrighty everyone, with today's video I just want to go over the past metas of Ascent and pretty much who won Ascent and sort of see if we could find a trend in Grand Archive with the way these go. I'm super excited to dive deep into this with you all. Been doing a lot of research, crunching the numbers, so yeah, cannot wait to share this information with you. Just a disclaimer to everyone out there, this is a number heavy video, so make sure if that is what you want to keep watching till the very end. Without further ado, Grand Archive had their first ever ascent in Houston with the DOA FTC meta block. Only 2 ascents total in this block, which is kind of crazy to think about. First ever ascent, Wind Allies goes ahead and takes that. Then our second ever ascent in Auckland, Fire Hybrid Merlin will go ahead and claim victory there. Game is still young and game is still growing. These ascents were small-ish for what we have now. Not a lot of players, not really a lot of deck crafting, theorizing. We only did have 2 sets, and a lot of the decks that were being played were sort of engineered from the Kickstarter with some innovation with, you know, Wind Allies taking the W in Ascent Houston. Now, the next set to come out after Fractured Crown FTC is going to be Alchemical Revolution, along with its partner set Mercurial Heart. And looking at here, with this season, the game has grown, we are getting more players in, which means more ascents, and we've actually spread out to not only a US and a overseas, we now have 2 additional overseas as well, so really cool to see. We have Ascent Ontario with Fire Erupting, and it's a very cool list because that was one that was running like 3 different champions. We then have Ascent Taipei, our first SEA Ascent, with Wind Allies once again claiming victory. Ascent Chicago with Wind Tristan taking the W, and this was right after MRC was released. And then Ascent Singapore with Slime Sylvie, you know, making a name for itself right here. After MRC, we did go into a brand new block, being our Mortal Ambition A and B and our Abyssal Heaven HVN set. And you know that means new set, even more ascents. We go up to 7 total ascents during this season, which is crazy. Ascent Toronto, the one that a lot of people don't think was real. We have Wind Vanitas taking it home. Ascent Christchurch, Slime Sylvie. And then we sort of get into this weird water meta, and we all know why, with the addition of Icebound Slam, Lost Them Thoughts, all those super strong. So we have Water Arizona, Water Nico, Water Nico. After that, Ascent Melbourne, Icebound Slam is banned, so we go to Water Fractals for Seattle, Water Fractals for Kuala Lumpur. After Abyssal Heaven, normally it would have ended, but thankfully with the release of Distorted Reflections and soon to be in December, Phantom Monarchs, we are now in a brand new DTR PTM season, and we just had our Ascent Boston where Fire and Soul Lorraine has taken the victory over the Dark Horse deck, which was the Wind Fire Vanitas list. And the purpose I went over these sort of decks and showing the progression is you wanted to see if there was kind of a trend or meta as we progressed through. It was sort of like when an element was strong, we clearly favored it, played it. We saw with the water decks, and then bans did really affect the meta. It switched from that Sylvie Nico deck into like a Water Fractals deck, things like that. So the question is, and I know a lot of people are talking about it after Ascent Boston, is Ryle ban-worthy? Should we ban it right now after our first Ascent? And that is the question we're going to answer here, just looking at numbers. So the one thing I do want to compare is the meta share of Ascents. So this is throughout each season, throughout the total events. So if you remember, DOA FTC had 2 ascents, ALC MRC had 4 ascents, AMB HVN had 7 ascents, and then DTR PTM just has 1 ascent. So looking at this, the first block meta was predominantly dominated by Fire. However, it shares a 50-50 win rate of Wind and Fire. And then we look at our next block, ALC and MRC, is once again dominated by fire. Wind is still creeping in there. And this was the one where we saw a lot of wind decks do take over. Norm, which was just being the slime Sylvie when it had baby gray slime, was doing really well. Then we move over to AMBHVN, and this is where like the numbers clearly tell us a story with the this is where the numbers clearly tell us a story, with the meta shifting from completely dominated by fire to fire being the lowest element compared to norm, water just clearly making a splash. And I think this is what devs look for when they do bannings and restrictions, things of that nature, when a Proxy's Vault card is introduced, because it's meant to pretty much help the meta heal naturally, opposed to them forcing something to occur. And clearly this jump between seasons, water, really something was crazy about it. And then we look at DTR and PTM, and this is just once again dominated by fire, which I feel like is very traditional at this point, fire being the dominant element but not really the best element. But some of you may be looking at this data and said, hey Valkyrie, this isn't really good statistics because these other blocks of metas have had multiple ascents. We're just looking at one for DTR PTM. Well, I'm glad you asked that question, viewer, because we're actually going to dive deep into it here. So this is the meta share of ascent, the first event of the season, and only top 32. Just because records do not go far back for Houston and past events, so we can't see every type of deck, so we just did top 32 sort of get a meta share here. And in DOA FTC, 57% of your top 32 was fire, then wind, followed by water. ALC and MRC, the first ever event, 66% dominated by fire as well. And then we look at the AMBHVN. This might be a little bit skewed, but it is something that happened and it's something to learn from. The first ever event, 81% Wind Vanitas because of the Razorgale 3 visits interaction. And for those of you who aren't familiar with that interaction, is there is a Fantasia that says whenever you activate a wind element spell, you deal 1 damage to a champion. And the old 3 visits said you may activate this card in from hand, from banishment, or from the graveyard, and if you do, you may rest your champion, recover 3, glimpse 2. And so what you could do is you could just chain activate 3 visits over and over again, dealing multiple damage with Razorgales. If you had multiple Razorgales on the field, the damage stacked. So it was a really, really strong deck. And it was one that a lot of people were also doom posting at the end of the event, saying this is way too crazy. And there was an immediate errata at the end of Ascent Toronto where they changed the way 3 visits was worded. Because of the card frame, they couldn't fit all the words, so they thought it was okay, but after seeing how the card actually read with that, it didn't work. So they had to change it to where you had to pay the cost of resting your champion to activate 3 visits, which really toned down Wind and Vanitas. So when we're looking at DTR PTM, we just got our ban list yesterday on 8/25, meaning Ryle is not eroded, it's not banned, but it's in category 2, meaning Weebs of the Shore are going to be watching this closely. If we compare these numbers, fire has always been dominant, except for one, for these metas. 82% I think is a huge meta share, but I also think it is because a lot of people are just on a one-track mind of, dang, Ryle is good, liminal guides are great, we're just gonna run that. And it even showed with the decks that counter Ryle, we're still running Ryle a little bit, and the liminal guide package, things like that. I do believe the number's going to naturally heal just slightly. I do see it coming down to maybe around a 70-75%, which may still be high in a meta share standpoint, but it's something to keep a look out for. I don't think we should ban outright Ryle right now. With fire being so dominant, let's go ahead and take a look at actually the decks winning ascents though. But we're looking at total ascent wins. Fire has won the least out of the 3 basic elements, with water actually being the mainstay problem when we had Lost in Thoughts and when we had Icebound Slam, followed by Wind, because Wind is very cheeky and can sneak in there, because I feel like Wind is very underutilized. Wind is a toolbox element that a lot of players don't realize that it's capable of doing. And you notice a lot of these times when Wind decks win Ascents, they're cheeky ally decks that have a tons of toolbox things to beat the meta, or they're really cool like value decks with Tristan, things of that nature. And then of course, as I said, Fire has the least amount of wins, even though it was the most popular in the meta share, which is crazy for 2 seasons straight. And then now this most recent season, it was the most popular element, and it still has the least amount of wins. And you could say, well, that's probably because there wasn't a lot of ascents, but it still happens. If Fire was as strong as people were claiming it was back then, it should have won Ascent Houston. It should have won a couple more ascents during the ALC MRC meta. But with this and all the information we're provided here, I just don't think Ryle is as big as a problem as people are making it. Now, don't, put down the pitchforks. I'm not saying Ryle isn't strong. What I'm saying is we haven't fully understood everything going on with the cards we have obtained. And I think Ryle is a decent deck. I feel like it will be here to stay, but it is not the end-all be-all. There is definitely stuff out there that can beat Ryle. There are definitely decks that can be prepared against Ryle. And I think with the Proxius Vault that was introduced to us, it feels like a little nudge in the direction of like, hey guys, go brew a little bit. In total, I do think Ryle decks are strong, but they're not going to be the thing that will keep us around forever. I do feel like that water meta we were a part of during the AMB HVN for those 5 ascents where water was winning with Lost in Thoughts running rampant, I don't think Ryle's going to be worse than that. If anything, it's going to be as equivalent as Lost in Thoughts, but not worse. Which means we may see the ban in a couple of ascents, if that's the case, since Lost in Thoughts did get banned. But I also think there's a lot more counterplay against Ryle than there is against Lost in Thoughts. That is just my personal opinion on that matter, though. And I really like looking at this data and going over it, because if we actually just take a look at it here again, and we see Fire-dominated meta, 1 wind, 1 fire. Fire-dominated meta, we have 2 wins, a Norm, and a Fire deck. And then this is a water-dominated meta, and we have 5 water decks taking ascent wins, then a wind deck because of, the event that didn't happen, and then a Norm deck. No fire decks won in AMB and HVN. So fire was pretty weak during this time. And I know a lot of players, there's aggro decks, things going around like that, but fire just wasn't really putting on that much results at big events. It was really outshined. So here it feels like fire decks got a big boost, and now people are like, hey, why did fire decks go from, was it 16% of the meta share all the way up to 82%? I feel, mark my words, in the next 2 ascents, this number's going down, 75%. And I feel like that would be a lot healthier. Not the best. I think, it should honestly be an even split, 33% for each element, but that's not how it works. There's always going to be something slightly favored, something strong. Game balancing is very difficult, but I do think we are on a right direction for a well-balanced game, and I can fully trust that the testing team did not leave us in a horrible meta, especially after a lot of people complained about the AMB HVN meta, because 2 horrid back-to-back metas would not look good for the game. And I am very confident Weebs of the Shore are smart enough to know not to do that to their player base, especially with how fast this game has grown. Once again, looking at the top 32, Win Vanitas and AMB HVN skewing numbers, but Fire has always been dominant in top 32. That's something to make a note about. This meta just so happens to be slightly stronger because of that Ryle package. And then our total ascent wins. But go ahead and tell me your thoughts about sort of the meta and the trends that you have noticed. I'm really curious to hear about all this information. I do want to point out the last time a fire deck won and a wind allies deck immediately took over. So I think, and I predict, next ascent, a fire deck, and then it's going to go back to wind winning. If not, wind will win the next ascent. Water is a great counter deck to the current meta, I believe, just hasn't been brewed enough. And people, I think, are a little hurt from the Lost in Thoughts banning still. But that's everything that I want to go over here. I do appreciate you guys taking your time to view this information, and hopefully it's helpful for any of you out there who's doing some testing and want to go over this as well. Till next video, see ya.